All right, Galileo died in 1642, and I'm going to consider that the end of an era. What we'll call here phase one, what I've been talking about so far, starting roughly around 1543 with the death of Copernicus, the originator of the heliocentric model of the universe. We have a great battle then between the early scientists and the church for epistemological supremacy. Should we use the more empirical observation, reason-based method, or should we only use reason if it is compatible with and nested within a broadly revelatory, scripture-based and tradition-based epistemology that the church is in charge of here? So phase one then is that particular battle. So we have Copernicus here. We have Giordano Bruno silenced in 1600, partway through this transition here. And in 1642, we have the death of Galileo. All right, 1642 is also coincidentally the year that Isaac Newton is born to the north in England, and that is significant because Newton's status and stature in the scientific landscape of the modern world can't be overestimated. He is huge, but in part he is made possible by the new intellectual landscape that occurred, and partly driven by the events that had gone on in the early century. If we have a century of very smart people doing innovative work in the sciences, being fearful of treading on sensitive theological toes, that can't but help but have long-term consequences for the intellectual health of your nation. The Renaissance started in Italy, but after 1642, on my interpretation, the Renaissance was largely over for Italy. Up until 1642, the best universities were in Italy. The best professors had been attracted there quite regularly. Students from all over Europe wanted to go to those universities to get the best training that they possibly could. But if the message is, if you say things that aren't safe, you will be burned at the stake, or you will be threatened with torture, you will be confined to house arrest, that sends a signal to various bright, independent-minded people. Don't go there if you want to do the first-rate intellectual work that you want to do in your career. So what happens then is that the center of intellectual activity shifts to Northern Europe. By the time we get to the middle part of the 17th century here, Europe is more or less split into a Protestant North and a Catholic South, a couple of exceptions there. But the Protestants, that's not to say that the Protestants were always nice to each other or nice to Jews or nice to Catholics, but the Protestants had evolved more of a live and let live, religiously tolerant attitude, partly because there were so many different religious sects. You can't continually fight and kill each other. And so there was a much more practice of tolerance on religious matters, and that spilled out into all kinds of other matters as well. And what this meant was that by the time we get to the end of the 17th century, most of the first-rate intellectual work and all of the great breakthroughs are being done in the north of Europe, in England, in Holland, and it is there that we find the rise of the next great generation of great universities and first-rate intellectual thought. And so phase two is, if we stick to the scientific community here, Isaac Newton being the great exemplar, working in England, mostly focused at the University of Cambridge. Now, what we then have, intellectually speaking, in terms of the epistemological battle, is that it is no longer possible for the Catholic Church to assert its intellectual authority over all of Europe. The Catholic Church is no longer the uniformly viewed intellectual authority or the universally viewed moral authority over all of Europe. There are lots of other intellectual authorities, lots of other moral authorities out there. So the church's hold is significantly weakened. Also, we are, by the time we get into the 1700s, entering into the era of a broad separation of church and state. In some cases that becomes formalized, in other cases it becomes informally the cultural practice in certain sorts of institutions. And what this means is that for those in theological positions of power, certain political tools or political weapons are increasingly being taken out of their hands. And from their perspective, as far as these early scientists go, the scientific cat is out of the bag. We can't just shut them down, intellectually speaking, and expect them to listen to us. And if we tell them to shut up and they don't shut up, we can't just shut them down by burning them at the stake and confining them to house arrest or otherwise censoring them. The scientists are doing what they're doing it well. Science is growing in prestige, and the scientists are increasingly encroaching on territory that religion had previously had a monopoly on. And in some cases, in the judgment of the educated people, the new answers that the scientists are coming up with are a whole lot better than the answers that the church had traditionally signed on with, further decreasing the prestige of the church and of religion in general, and dramatically increasing the prestige of science here. So what we have here is an era of both intellectual and political authority, being resided in the religion of the time and institutionalized in the church. But by the time we get over to the early 1700s, the center of gravity has shifted, and what we have is the church and religion more on the defensive, and it is the scientific method, and more broadly, the method of using reason to approach intellectual matters is the institution that is on the rise here. So put it in a slightly cutesy fashion, phase two then involves a change of strategy for the church. People will no longer believe us just because we say so, and we can't force them to believe what we want them to do so. So there's a fairly dramatic shift in the intellectual strategy used by many of the theologians, and I think of it as an if you can't beat them, join them kind of strategy. The idea here being is that we should be able to use the method of reason, not simply on these new scientific issues, but also to apply those methods to issues of reason, religion rather, and theology. So we should use the method of reason in religious matters as well. So rather than the tradition that had been the dominant tradition in phase one, I say the dominant tradition was in the exclusive tradition of what is called revealed theology. That is to say, we're trying to give an account of God or a theological understanding of the university, but ultimately our authority is revelation as captured in Scripture and in the Catholic tradition as interpreted by the authorized interpreters of Scripture. Rather than this being our fundamental epistemological approach, what we will do in theology is embrace more systematically a theological tradition known as natural theology. A natural theology sounds a lot like what scientists do. That is to say, we're still trying to give an account of God, but we're trying to give an account of God through nature. And what we will do is, just like rational people everywhere, try to prove the reasonableness of believing in the existence of God and believing in our particular God as being a reasonable supposition as well. And we will do that by looking at the world, observing the features of the world, and coming up with the best explanation, the best hypothesis that gives a complete and thorough account of the existence and structure of the universe as it actually is. And then the new hope in phase two is that if we do what the scientists do in their particular fields, we can prove to a reasonable person that belief in the existence of God is a reasonable thing to do. And if we are Christian, as most people in Europe still were at this point, that the belief in the Christian religion in particular is also a reasonable belief as well. So we're going to de-emphasize revelation, we're going to de-emphasize faith, we're going to de-emphasize prophecy, we're going to emphasize evidence, argument, reason. That is to say, we haven't been able to beat the scientists down entirely, the cat is out of the bag, so we're going to join them and use the same tools to the prestige of science, and so hopefully there will then be a reconciliation of science and religion as opposed to this enmity that had led to certain amounts of bloodshed in the earlier era. All right, I'm going to call that phase two, mostly on through the 1700s.